The Institute for Risk Management in South Africa's annual risk report provides important and insightful information for all decision makers in organizations in South Africa. The 8th edition of this report is out in February 2022. What can I tell you about it? Well, it will build on IRMSA's role as a catalyst for positive, meaningful change in South Africa. And that's all reflected in the theme hashtag Step Up. Now is the time. One of the supporters of the report is Dr. Morne Mostert from the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University and joins me now. Morne, a very warm welcome. It's good to see you again. Before we talk about the big local and global risk landscapes, King 4, you've just made an important presentation to the King 4 committee. What was the top line?
Thanks, Jeremy. My main argument with the thought leadership group of the King Commission is that a lack of discerning strategic foresight is poor corporate governance. And if I may be so bold, I suspect that in the next few years, that will be a legislated requirement, that foresight work, so-called vigilant firms, companies that deliberately examine the future. That kind of practice, I argue, should be an essential requirement for good governance in large organizations.
Why do you think there's a lack of foresight?
Well, I base that in part on research in various organizations and also, Jeremy, in my own practice in advisory work, not only in 11 or 12 countries in Africa, but also in Europe, in Geneva and Paris and Rome and London and so on, and a lot of it in the Middle East. But I can tell you, Jeremy, on the ground, in practice, even senior executives, even top executives are absolutely consumed with the matters of the day and the 90-day reporting cycle. While that, in a certain sense, is responsible behavior towards investors, analysts, and the like, the dilemma is that it removes the view from the longer-term responsibility that large organizations have towards their shareholders, towards their staff, towards their suppliers, other stakeholders, but also towards the broader society and indeed the planet.
Let me take a contrary view, if I can, just to stimulate the conversation. And let me put to you, Morne, that the paradigm is shifting so quickly all the time that it has become almost impossible to develop that foresight that you're talking about, that we're almost held hostage by that 90-day cycle.
Yes, Jeremy, I would say that is an intellectually lazy escape from the responsibilities. Here's my argument. Of course, it's true that the change is happening all the time. And as strategic foresight students, we are not concerned with predicting the future. So this is an important distinction to make. Prediction is not, in fact, our main objective. What we try to recognize is that more than one future is possible, and a responsible practice on corporate governance and risk management is to investigate those multiple possible futures. And then, very importantly, to allow those insights to inform longer-term strategy. So here's the biggest distinction between traditional strategy and strategic foresight. It is this, that in traditional strategy, we have an as-is state, an analysis of the day, and then some sort of ambition for the future. Of course, that's encouraging, that's fantastic, we should go somewhere. The difference between that and strategic foresight is that the latter recognizes that more than one future is possible. In other words, in traditional strategy, you are exposing the organization to the risk of examining only one future, a single future, which you think you are the sole author of, when in reality, now to come back to the substance of your question, in reality, the changes are so myriad that ignoring those changes in how they shape the future, I argue, is irresponsible.
So how then do executive teams need to apply their mind to developing that strategic foresight? What are the questions that they need to be asking of themselves and stakeholders within their broader operating landscape?
I think you're so right to start there with the questions, Jeremy. That's our main argument. It really is about the quality of the questions. What are those questions? We recognize that the past is important. And in fact, we use a little acronym known as OPATCH. So we say, if you want to make sense of the past for future purposes, you can look at that acronym OPATCH, which is an indication of the origins. Where does the place come from? So think about the birth of South Africa, highly contentious question, right? Or the birth of your institution. That gives you some sense of the kind of the DNA of the place. Then to look at patterns, those behaviors that we repeat again and again and again. Attitudes are kind of emotional reactions to things. We like certain things, dislike others. The T is for traditions, the way we celebrate our rituals, how we reward people and so on. The C is for culture, and that means both institutional culture as well as regional, even ethnic culture when it comes to globalization. And then the H is for habits. Habits is a really interesting one, because one way to define a habit is that a habit is something that you do without thinking. Now, we can then wonder, well, if you accept that definition, Jeremy, then what is a thinking habit? Well, this is an instance where you think that you're thinking strategically, but in fact, there's very little thinking going on. It's in fact a copy and paste of last year, plus more or less 8% and cut costs by 6%. Then just those questions on the present, they're really about what we call a transdisciplinary scan, looking far and wide, including beyond your own industry. And I can say a little bit more about that if you want. And then just briefly on the questions for the future, we want to think about what happens when these multiple factors that you mentioned start to intersect at those intersections at a distant horizon, beyond the normal planning horizon of, let's say, 1 to 3 years, at 10 years, let's say, when those multiple forces intersect, what kind of pictures do they start to paint about the future? Those, I would say, are the fundamental questions.
So let me ask you this then as a follow-up. Let's assume that you get the answers to those questions that you have posed. How do you make that strategic foresight then part of your living and operating strategy?
Right. Here's what we find. When people look at the future, the way they think about the future changes. It's really quite bizarre. Let me give you a practical example. In one study, test subjects were asked to look at themselves, photographs of themselves 30 years from today. So with software, their faces were aged and so on. And what was fascinating in that study is that subjects that did not see themselves 30 years from today were much less likely to invest in their own pension funds as those who did see themselves 30 years from today. In other words, in a sense, they were seeing something of the future, not an exact prediction, but the mere consideration of the future changes the kind of decisions we make today. So that's the first thing. How does that then translate into strategy? Well, it means that it changes the way we think about the strategic objectives we have. Far beyond, of course, outdated notions of business being purely for profit, to consider a much more holistic view of how the future might unfold. Consider, Jeremy, the impact organizations have had on our planet over the last 60 years. The fact that we do kind of last year plus 8% means the conversation is devoid of considerations of social impact, of environmental impact, and we can see the effect of that short-termism around us today. So the temptation, though, I must say, of that short-termism is enormous. It's really the sort of default option. Look at the spreadsheet, look at what's gone up or down in the last 3 years, pick the one you think is your favorite and the most viable, add 8% to that, add a stretch target with some bonuses for executives, and off you go, gung-ho, launch it at the convention center with balloons and doves and half-naked acrobats, and off we go. Well, I would say we're in a time now where we just can no longer afford to think of strategy like that.
I understand that, but I'm assuming that you've also got to have one eye on that short-term horizon.
Yeah.
And this informs this question. What, in your opinion, then, for 2022 are the significant emerging strategic risks that organizations need to be applying their mind to? In other words, in the here and now.
Yes. So you formulated the dilemma quite articulately. So it is considering in the here and now what is not yet in the here and now. That is the dilemma. So I would say that if we start in the macro environment, then just right off the bat, if you don't have your relationship with society very well articulated, I'd say you're exposing your organization to enormous risk. That means thinking about the role that your institution plays in the society. If you're a mine or you're burning coal or whatever it is, you need to really think about what does that mean for the people around me. Very closely linked to that, of course, is the environmental impact. We've gone far beyond now the idea that somehow climate is for long-haired hippies and tree huggers. This is now a matter of survival, and considering your footprint on the planet and how, in fact, you contribute to reduce your own footprint in a hyper-aggressive way. We're rapidly running out of time, I would say, is another imperative. Then looking at the broader demographics, I would say, if you look at Africa, for example, in its demographic profile, I would say it is responsible to consider your relationship on a specific segment of society, and that is the youth. We have an emerging demographic bubble, potentially known as a demographic dividend, which means an increasing number of people of working age, as in a ratio of those who are of dependent age. That is potentially a dividend. But if we do not pay specific attention to that, that will end up being a tax. Of course, in addition to society, both the broader society, the environment, and the youth, I would say we need to think about the finance mechanisms around our institutions. In other words, what the Club of Rome calls rethinking finance. And that includes how people get access to finance to make use of our goods and services. If we don't rethink that, we are perpetuating the vast discrepancies and inequalities, not only in South Africa, but all around the world. And then the broader economic role that we play in an attempt to reframe our economic contribution, I think, is absolutely essential. Now, you may say, gosh, I'm an executive in a company that makes bottles. Why should I concern myself with all of this? Well, one of the reasons is that, in fact, the society and the environment are already funding your business. You don't make the water you use. You get it from the planet. You don't make your own consumers. They trust you and engage with you. So for far too long, I think institutions have had a kind of corporate agnosticism where they could say, well, we're only in the game of, advancing the interests of our shareholders and, maybe being a little bit responsible here and there. The time for that has now truly run out. And if we don't take it seriously, here I'll close this observation, Jeremy. If we don't take it seriously, what we have to pay attention to is the international business world is taking these issues increasingly seriously. And that means we will become isolated if we don't do it ourselves.
And let me finish then with this question. You have raised big, important topics, but in the next year or so, what is the potential for all of that to be ambushed, derailed, set off course by the pandemic?
one of the risks that I've identified in the global landscape is the possibility for some governments as well as large organizations to respond opportunistically with regards to COVID. And in that sense, COVID poses an enormous risk, but of course it's really our response to it. So what do I mean? For governments, that means policy opportunism. That little policy, perhaps borderline dictatorship policy that's been lying in my top drawer for the last 18 months, I can now hide the explanation for that policy behind COVID. I can now introduce my own biases into policy and explain it away because of COVID in the same way that some countries have done, for example, with the interest of national security. Once you use that phrase, the discussion is over. There's no more intellectual engagement. You don't have to explain yourself. So in the same way, I think there is a risk for policy opportunism, especially in those kind of borderline dictatorships, some benevolent autocracies that really want to engineer a society in a very specific way. For institutions, the risk is to explain bad service simply because of, let's say, supply chain dilemmas, because of, guess what, COVID. And I think one of the imperatives for boards is to hold executives responsible by, and this is another dimension of strategic foresight, hold executives responsible by being competitor conscious. So in other words, if executives say, well, our supply chain's being disrupted, that's why we have this kind of service to our stakeholders, well, this is why we haven't paid attention to the environment. Well, let's look at competitor behavior. And in that way, our contextual awareness refines the kind of decisions we make. I think essential for risk management in the future.
And that is a salutary warning about the dangers of expediency as well. And I appreciate the view. Dr. Morne Mostert from the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Loved it. Thanks, Jeremy.